Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Fudge. I'm from Weber State University. I forgot my name tag this morning, but I'll make sure to grab that at lunchtime. It is my pleasure to introduce Deborah Tollefsen from the University of Memphis, who will be talking to us about her book project. So,
thank you. I want to thank the Templeton Foundation for funding my research, and to Christian and Tobias for running the project so well. So I was funded to write a manuscript, complete a draft of a manuscript. I'm happy to say that I have done that. It is it's in need of a lot of revisions, and so hopefully those will take place this year, and it'll get published. I'm glad that we're not meeting next year, because then I would have to tell you the results. You'll have to find out on your own what happens to it. So I want to start with a story. Early in his career, Danny Thomas attended a Catholic Mass in Detroit. After the Mass, he made a small offering to St. Jude Thaddeus and prayed that the saint would intercede on his behalf. He was struggling to make ends meet as an entertainer, and didn't know how he was going to support his family. Thomas promised St. Jude that if he interceded on his behalf, he would build him a shrine. Shortly after, he got a paying gig, and years later became a successful entertainer. In 1957, he established the American Lebanese Syrian Associated Charities, ALSEC, which is the nonprofit organization that raises money to fund St. Jude's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. St. Jude's opened its door in 1962. The research conducted at St. Jude's has increased the survival rate of childhood cancer from 20% to 80% since that time. Roughly 4 out of 5 children survive if they're treated at St. Jude's. St. Jude's treats infants and children of all ages to 21, sometimes even beyond that to age 25, from all over the world, and also has an international outreach program that focuses on the transfer of knowledge throughout the world. In addition, St. Jude pays for treatment not covered by insurance and offers assistance to families and for transportation, lodging, and meals. Recently, St. Jude Research Hospital has facilitated the removal of over 400 Ukrainian children with cancer to treatment facilities across the US and Europe. Intuitively, St. Jude's Research Hospital is a benevolent and generous organization. How are we to understand virtue at the level of organizations? This is the basic question motivating my research, and the book focuses on the virtue of honesty. Okay, let's see, how come, oh, there we go. So this is roughly the overview. I'm going to take you through each of the chapters. Unfortunately, because of time, I'm not going to be able to spend too much time in developing the arguments, and I'm happy to expand on any of them, the issues in the Q&A. So chapter 1, virtues are character traits, and a trait is a stable disposition to act and form attitudes under certain circumstances. The question of whether and how organizations can be honest or dishonest then rests on some more fundamental questions. How do they act and form attitudes, and what is organizational character? So this chapter takes up these questions. And I start by distinguishing organizations from other types of groups. I don't give necessary and sufficient conditions. Rather, I identify a set of features that are characteristic of organizations. One of those features is that organizations are created to meet certain goals. I think this feature is important for making sense of the moral obligations of organizations. In particular, I think it's important for understanding aspects of organizational honesty. So I highlight it in that first chapter. Keep in mind that although the corporate firm is an organization and a paradigmatic one, so are hospitals, universities, nonprofits, and governments. Oftentimes when I talk to audiences about organizational honesty or virtue, they focus on the corporate case. And they are convinced that corporations are vicious, but not so much virtuous. So keep in mind that when I talk about organizations, I'm talking about a wide range, not just the corporate case, although I do use a lot of examples from the corporate, there's lots of cases of dishonest corporations, so they do loom large in certain chapters. So how do organizations act? Organizational acts are constituted in part by the actions of individuals, either acting alone in their roles within the organization or acting jointly together with others within the organization. I say in part because I think organizations, like human beings, have extended their agency by the use of technology. So any token action may consist of other things than just the actions of individual human beings. I appeal to the notion of proxy action, which builds on Kirk Ludwig's work on this, to sort of make sense of how either individuals or collections of individuals, say a research group or a decision-making group, can act on behalf of the organization. So often an organization acts in virtue of an individual within the organization acting as its proxy. And in some cases, the individual actions, together with the constitutive rules that govern the action type in question, wholly constitute the organization's action. When a CEO signs a contract, for instance, to produce certain goods for a certain amount of money, the CEO signing the contract constitutes the company being contracted, and the obligations and entitlements of that contract confer on the company, not the CEO. Sometimes, however, organizations act not via a single member acting as a proxy, but via a subgroup that acts together on behalf of the organization. The executive committee of a university, for instance, might deliberate and make a decision and enact a policy. Their action constitutes the university enacting a policy. So what licenses the redescription of individual actions and joint actions as the actions of the organization? Here I develop the notion of an intentional infrastructure, the roles, rules, procedures that guide and coordinate individual actions across time. Organizations can act, but are they agents? Here I appeal to my previous work in the Groups as Agents book to argue that organizations are interpretable from the intentional stance. And this gives us a good reason for believing that we're dealing with agents of a certain sort. They're an artificial agent, right? I don't claim they're people, for instance, or like human beings in all respects. So in order to be able to talk about organizational honesty and dishonesty, I need a framework for thinking about organizational virtue in general. So this chapter offers such a framework. And I begin with a review of various theories of virtue, outcomes-based versus motive-based theories. I then rule out summative accounts of organizational virtue as insufficient, because I argue you can have cases where a group can be virtuous or vicious when no member has that trait, either locally or globally. And you can have cases where everyone in the group or the organization has a certain virtue or vice, and it's not exhibited at the level of the organization. I use the example of generosity here, and I'm happy to talk about that example in the Q&A. I emphasize that for an organization to have virtue, it must be a trait of the organization. This means we need to make sense of an organizational trait. Traits are dispositions. So I developed the notion of a collective disposition that's described as a set of individual dispositions to do one's part. And I offer the following initial proposal and extend it to vice. An organization O has virtue V if its structure is such that it induces in members the dispositions to do their part and coordinates those parts in such a way that when actualized, they bring about organizational actions that are characteristic of V in appropriate circumstances. So I then consider, so if I stopped right there, it gives a kind of consequentialist account of organizational virtue. I run that for the vice as well, or vices. But then I consider some cases that motivate the need for a motivational element. Some corporations, for instance, have changed their business practices to appeal to environmental concerns. They may be bringing about virtuous outcomes, but if their aim is simply to make money by appealing to a rapidly changing consumer landscape, many of us would withhold attributions of virtue in that case. So it seems like we need something like organizations that are acting for the right reasons or have the right motivations. How are we to understand that in the organizational case? Well, I appeal to the work on group reasons. Remo Tuomela's work here is central. Finally, I consider whether organizations could be virtuous or vicious on more stringent accounts of virtue that require something like proper emotion or affect. I argue that, or sort of concede, that organizations do not have themselves affect or emotion. And I make the provocative, though tentative, claim that the failure of those stringent accounts to accommodate virtue and vice at the organizational level suggests that those accounts are inadequate as a general theory of virtue or vice. So on the account I'm offering here, a generous organization does not have to have generous members. The organization's members could be selfish, but if the members do their part, play their role, and those roles are coordinated in such a way that they bring about on a regular and stable basis organizational actions that are generous and that are responsive to good motivating reasons of the organization, this would count as a generous organization. So in Chapter 3, I develop and defend an account of organizational honesty and dishonesty, rather than begin with a theory of what honesty and dishonesty is. I begin with several examples of organizations that are intuitively dishonest. Sadly, there are many cases to choose from, but by looking at these examples, we can extract central features of dishonest behavior in organizations and then ask what theory of dishonesty and by extension honesty can accommodate these features. This approach avoids begging the question. If we start with a theory of honesty or dishonesty that's been developed only on the basis of how it is manifest in individual human beings, we risk ruling out organizations as honest or dishonest at the outset of our inquiry. What I conclude after looking at these cases is that they all, unsurprisingly, involve the intentional distortion of facts. But the intentional distortion is really a collaborative affair in these cases, in which many individuals contribute to it. These cases also suggest that there's more to organizational honesty than merely not distorting the facts. In some cases, it involves what Taya Cohen and her colleagues call fostering understanding, or what might be thought of as transparency. So then I ask, well, is there a philosophical account that can make sense of this, or these cases, or what appear to be honest and dishonest organizations? And I take up Christian Miller's account. It is by far the most developed philosophical account of honesty and dishonesty. And I kind of run with that for a while to see how far we can go. That involves developing analogs of various aspects of his theory, such as the need to develop the notion of an organization's point of view, because for him it's the intentional distortion of facts as the agent sees them, and so we need a sense of what it is for an organization to have a point of view. It also requires me to flesh out more organizational reasons and how they might be distinct from individual members' reasons. And then at the end, I take up the debate between Miller and Jason Bayer and others on whether honesty requires more than simply not distorting the facts. And I argue that organizational honesty does seem to involve more. In particular, I argue that organizational honesty involves transparency. Does this mean that honesty is different for organizations than individuals, or that somehow Christians' view is insufficient? Until Thursday, I was tempted to argue that, but when I met with Christians' wonderful scholars who came for a summer seminar, in particular Pilar and others, sort of said they're not so sure. It could be, because Miller allows for special obligations, it might be that in the case of organizations we have, and that's sort of the argument that I've run, organizations are set up for certain goals, they have special obligations. The idea would be that the difference isn't in the concept of honesty, but in the relationship between society and the organization. Right, so honesty would be the same in individuals and organizations. It's just that the relationship between organizations and society is different and calls for special obligations. So I'm still thinking through that part of it. Then I take up, because I do think transparency is a special feature of organizational honesty. I take up the topic of transparency. They have these special obligations to be transparent, and I try to lay out what I take transparency to be in Chapter 4. I begin with discussions of 2 articles on public transparency, O'Neill's article, the Reith Lectures, and T. Nguyen's article, Transparency as Surveillance. I really like both of these, but I find some problems. Basically, I argue that the problem isn't transparency. The problem is, in T's case, the metrics used. I think when you understand transparency correctly, it doesn't run into the problems that T and Onora point out. One of the interesting things about both of those articles is they argue that transparency actually undermines trust. And one of the arguments I make in this chapter is that transparency actually relies on trust. So the example I use is no amount of disclosure of the warrant to search Trump's property is going to make certain people believe the government has a case against him, right? So there has to be some minimal sort of level of trust in order for transparency to actually achieve its goals. And I also argue that transparency requires understanding the epistemic needs of one's audiences, and that certain audiences will need more or less information to foster understanding. And so transparency really is a contextual matter, and it involves both quantity and quality. So I developed this account where you've got the quantity and quality on the X and the Y axis, and you can place transparency in those regions, and they'll vary what counts as transparent according to the context. So in general, what I think the failures of transparency show, the ones that both Onora and T have pointed out, is that transparency has 2 dimensions, quantity or quality, and the quality has to do with the depth, the details, the discursive method that you're using, legibility. I think you mentioned legibility. And that's also going to depend on the context. Some businesses are going to have to be more transparent with certain audiences. The CIA, for instance, given their context, quantity and quality is much more restrained. So I finished by discussing Ryan Barley's great work on transparency and distinguish my own account from it. I don't think organizational transparency itself is a virtue, but a requirement of organizational honesty due to the special nature of the relationship between organizations and society. In chapter 5, I take up the case of lying organizations. So I'm focusing specifically on one way that organizations can be dishonest, rather than, again, start with a theory of what lying is. I start with some cases and kind of tease out what's happening in those cases and ask what philosophical theory of lying might accommodate these cases. And again, the method there is that I don't want to kind of beg the question with respect to organizations. What I arrive at is really the idea that inferentialism has the best hope of understanding organizational lies. I really have to start with an account of institutional assertion, which I've developed in a recent article. And that is sort of based on the notion that assertions are commitments. So for Brandom, belief is defined in terms of assertion rather than the other way around. To believe that P is to be disposed to assert that P in various circumstances and make certain inferences on the basis of it. There's other philosophers who have thought about belief as a commitment. So there's ways in which you could understand organizational belief as a form of a commitment. So assertion then is defined in terms of the notion of a commitment. And I develop this commitment theory of assertion. And then I explain lying along the lines that I think Brandom would need to explain lying. He doesn't really have an explicit theory of lying. But I think we can understand lying in the organizational case as a case of double entry scorekeeping. So if you're familiar with Brandom, he has this kind of scorekeeping model of the kind of discursive environment. The interlocutors keep track of their own scorecard and the scorecards of others, what kind of assertions have been made and what follows from those assertions. When organizations make assertions to the public, they get added to the organization's scorecard, which indicates the inferential and practical commitments of the organization. And on the basis of this, we expect the organization to be able to defend the assertion. But in the case of organizational lying, the organization is keeping two scorecards, one external and one internal. It's basically the linguistic form of keeping two sets of books. The moral and practical consequences of committing to, say, tobacco is addictive were too great for tobacco companies, and so they sought to avoid the consequences for the corporation of such an assertion by asserting a different proposition, tobacco is not addictive. But once the discursive environment within the organization is revealed, and this is exactly what was revealed in the tobacco papers, which is a set of documents that were given to researchers by a whistleblower, it seems clear there's an additional scorecard that has on it tobacco is addictive, and clearly inferential and practical moves were made within the organization on the basis of that proposition. I talk a lot about the other accounts of organizational lies and group lies and group assertion, and kind of respond to Jennifer Lackey's work on this as well. Finally, the last chapter brings up the issue of the relationship between honest or dishonest organizations and honest and dishonest people. So one of the results of my theory is that it's possible for organizations to be virtuous or vicious even if their members are not. And further, they can fail to be virtuous even if all their members are virtuous. But the possibility of a divergence between the character of an organization and the character of its members, particularly its leader, is just that, a possibility. In most cases, virtuous members will contribute in direct ways to organizational virtue and vice. So one of the reasons for thinking organizational virtue and vice are valuable concepts is that there might be a sort of trickle-down theory, right, or trickle-down effect that happens within organizations such that virtuous organizations cause members to be better, if not virtuous. And likewise for viciousness. Could working for an honest organization, for instance, make one more honest? I did a lot of research this last summer on this, last fall on this particular question. And so I was hoping there was more empirical literature on this. There's lots of great work on honesty within organizations where they're focusing on the ways that individuals, whether they're honest or dishonest within their job. But nothing specifically that asks this question. If you have some kind of top-down approach where you set the honesty agenda and you see whether that influences the individuals within the organization. There is, of course, discussion of corporate culture and the impact of leadership on individuals' behavior in the organization, but nothing directly on the question of honesty. We know in the corporate case, for instance, that fraud, such as the Wells Fargo case, there were incentives in place, corporate incentives, that really allowed for individual dishonesty. And so there's good evidence that when you set up certain structures in an organization that incentivizes bad behavior, it does influence individual behavior. And so I kind of make the case that it's plausible that if you set up incentives to incentivize good behavior, virtuous, honest behavior, that it would have the same effect. And then I turn to make a more abstract argument for thinking that attributions of virtue and vice to organizations might shape the behavior of individuals within the organization and eventually the character of the individuals within the organization. Attributions of virtue and vice at the individual level, when we ascribe to individuals, have a sort of proleptic nature. And I look at the work of Mark Alfano here. Alfano has argued that attributions of virtue and vice often act as self-fulfilling prophecies. And I suggest that that institutions, when we ascribe attributions of virtue and vice to organizations, they have a kind of ability to shape the behavior of individuals within the institution. And once that happens, there's a kind of cycle effect here, because once you change individual behavior, right, you set up expectations for those individuals to contribute in certain ways according to the goals set by the organization. It turns out that that contributes to organizational actions, which then might be more likely to be virtuous than otherwise. So the attributions have a kind of mind shaping. They shape the minds of individuals, which in turn shape the mind of the organization, and so on. Okay, that's a quick overview of the article. I can't seem to get it to move there. And my thank you. Of the book. I do want water. I think I'm going to have to go get some. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. That was great. This is really just a small question about the relationship between what you have in Chapter 6 and a claim that you made early on about the this analogy between organizations and individuals where virtue is concerned and that organizations don't have affect. And it seems like organizational culture actually is where you would find what's analogous to affect in an individual. And so I wondered if you can actually, if it is possible to draw the analogy a little bit more closely with individual virtue. You don't have to say, well, this is just a complete absence of crossover in this particular place.
Yeah.
How the individuals who are not directly involved in the honesty or the dishonesty from a agential standpoint, but are part of the organization, right? How culture shapes how they feel, right? It seems like an affectual aspect of the organization.
Yeah, so I have another chapter that talks about, but I'm thinking of cutting it, about it develops a general collective virtue and vice where I'm focusing on smaller groups. And I talk about shared emotion. So there's lots of literature in the social ontology area that develops accounts of shared emotion. And I kind of appeal to that to make the claim that you could get a really stringent Aristotelian account on that. It seems less likely. I mean, you could say that they share. I just don't think in a big corporation that there's anything like shared emotion, right, or shared affect. I just think it's too. You could use corporate culture, but then I don't know what that is. Like, there's so little real unpacking of that. I just don't think people will buy it. I'm happy to sort of try to make that claim, but the Aristotelians who hold, Zagzebski has this, you have to have a specific emotion, say, for the epistemic virtues. I just don't think they're going to buy it.
So are you willing to, this is partly a related question that I also had. I mean, it does seem like you're going to get a closer analogy just in general with smaller or closely held corporations than you are with extremely large organizations.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's the general picture of virtue that you're interested in?
Yes, yeah. So there's two ways in which, when we're talking about small groups, I think virtue is less likely unless those small groups, because developing collective dispositions requires that they act together on a regular basis over time. So a small committee that meets and then disbands, they're not going to be virtuous. So the smaller groups that are going to be virtuous is something like an athletic team. There's lots of good research on team skill and stuff that I think makes the case that you could talk about them as virtuous. So there's going to be limiting cases in the small group. In the organizational case, I make this claim about agency too. Certain organizations are going to fail to be agents because they're not unified. So the bigger organization and disparate, and unorganized you get, the less likely our attributions of agency are going to take hold. We're not going to be able to explain them from the intentional stance. And I think the case is the same case as for virtue, and the less organized, unified the organization will be, the less likely it will be to be virtuous and vicious. So that also means that some corporate cases of horrible actions are going to turn out to be more like natural events than something we would hold them morally responsible for. Of course, we can hold them responsible for not realizing this would happen, but for the event itself, it might have just been an accident or something. Yeah.
Christian.
Actually, more on the affect, so I found that really interesting, and I love, of course, I love the project in general. Two parts to it. One is, sometimes we do seem to talk about organizations having affective states. This organization really cares about its employees.
Yeah.
This organization really wants what's best for its customers.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have to give an error theoretic treatment of that and kind of explain away why we make those attributions of affective states to those organizations? And then second, what's the key difference when it comes to cognitive states? So why is that affective states don't seem to work, but I assume you do want to say that belief-like states can be attributed
Yeah.
to organizations.
Yeah.
What's the key difference maker that allows one but not the other?
Phenomenology. Like, a lot of people are going to say the difference between propositional attitudes and something like affect is that it's phenomenology, right? Phenomenal states, consciousness, basically. And so I've never wanted to say that organizations are conscious. Now, if you want to take a purely cognitivist account of emotion and affect, that would work fine for me. But most people, no, they want phenomenology. Yeah.
Okay. And on the other points, do you have to?
Oh, that's right.
Explain what those.
Yeah, I mean, I could say, well, in those cases, we're harnessing kind of the cognitive aspect of those concepts, like care. If you can give a purely cognitivist account of care, where it doesn't require kind of feeling whatever it is that they require. I mean, I don't think that's the right account of care, right? Because I feel like I can care for and be caring even though I'm very frustrated right now and don't feel anything, right? So, but the worry is that I don't want to take on arguing for cognitivist accounts, so I kind of just grant that if you think this kind of affect and what essentially consciousness is required for virtue, organizations don't have it.
Just to follow up. Sort of on this point, I was thinking of the common on culture, which is interesting to think through, and the cognitive about like these companies that make best places to work lists and they do employee satisfaction surveys.
Yeah.
And I certainly take your point that there's always going to be variability, but there's also some shared, you can look at mean levels where there's some organizations where the vast majority of employees are very satisfied and maybe even emotionally happy, and then others, and so and maybe that's culture or maybe that's emotion or affect. I'm curious your thoughts on like employee satisfaction as a indicator, and maybe it's cognitive, sort of how you're talking, Christian, or maybe it's not. So that would be the closest indicator, I think.
Right. So I think that my critic will say, you can point to that, but that's not the satisfaction of the organization, right? That's just satisfaction of its members. And so whatever affect is present might be shared among members or it might be in particular members, but it's not at the organizational level. And the very stringent views of virtue require that the agent itself have this kind of affect or emotion.
So the agent itself has put practices and processes in place that give rise to the members feeling a certain way, but that's not the same as the agent itself having the feelings. If that makes a lot of
I've been thinking about emotions for organizations. We at least attribute a lot in the sports context, right? We'll say the Nuggets are hyped that they won the NBA championship. The Lakers are sad that they got eliminated. They're angry at the refereeing. And it also seems we attribute thick notions of belief, like they believe in their rookie, where it's not just a cognitive kind of thing. So there's at least a lot of it. And I feel like it's more, I do feel like it's harder to do it for like the Shell Corporation or something.
They're angry about the legislation.
Right, I guess. But it seems especially easy with sports. Maybe there's a tightly integrated set of like joint, if you're thinking about some of these attitudes in a more functionalist way, then it does feel like, there are goals that they have joint preferences for, and you can maybe.
Agreed. If you give a functionalist account of attitudes, right, that's basically why I think organizations are agents and have attitudes. And so if you can give a functionalist account of emotion, you can do that. I think there's interesting studies where people are asked, how likely are you to attribute certain attitudes to corporations? And it does turn out from these studies, they're somewhat limited, that people are more likely to attribute cognitive attitudes than phenomenal attitudes. The one thing that I've been writing about in the group agency stuff is this mind shaping and the kind of ways in which attitudes ascriptions are proleptic. And you might think that what's happening in those cases when the organization says we care about our employees is it's not tracking an actual state of the institution, but it's rather setting up a kind of policy and thereby setting up expectations which change the individual's behavior within it. And then eventually they might conform to something like a profile of a caring agent, right, where that's described functionally, I would say.
Interesting. Can I ask one other question? So this is about the assertion stuff, about how much you want the Brandomian belief commitment stuff as opposed to, because you can get a commitment kind of view of assertion without going in for the full Brandomian.
Yeah.
And he gets the scorekeeping stuff from, Lewis arguably gets it from Hamlet in the 50s, right?
Oh, okay.
So there's like commitment theories of assertion that don't have the, the inferentialism of Brando. So
Yeah.
do you want that fuller stuff, belief as commitment as belief, or do you just want the commitment theory of assertion?
I just want the commitment theory of assertion, and honestly, the reason why I want this is I'm so tired of arguing for group beliefs that I just thought, but maybe I'll just try to skip over the whole idea of whether they have beliefs, although I do argue they're agents and that those attitudes are appropriately attributed to them. So I do like the scorecard keeping stuff because then I could talk about the two sets of scorecards, like analogous to the two sets of books. And that really does come out in the cases that I look at because what we're actually doing is looking at the difference in discursive environments, actually. We're looking at their public assertions and essentially their private internal discursive environment, and that to me it fits nicely with the scorecard stuff.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear, talk about your book on Thursday, and it's cool to see how it fits in with the rest. I was interested in what you had to say about transparency and trust, because I had the same intuition reading those two pieces that it presupposes trust in some cases, and I'm wondering what you think can be done in cases where there is already distrust. So increasing transparency in that case seems like it could make it worse.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, I know it's kind of beyond the scope of this particular book, but I just was curious what your intuitions are.
I have no idea. Particularly with our political, the divisions right now, I have no idea how you would ever get to a point where we trusted one another. I'll have to think about it. I don't have anything to say right now about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it's really interesting when you're talking about how, obviously the whole point of this is that an organization can have different virtues and vices than the individuals that are in it. One example of that could be, the honest CEO who nonetheless feels that he has to make decisions to withhold information from his employees or from the public or whatever about certain things for the sake of his business or something else. Do you have any thoughts about that? What accounts for those differences where you have, completely opposite sides of the virtue and vice spectrum with the individuals in the organization?
Do you mean what accounts for competing moral obligations?
Maybe another way to say it is how do you what do you think causes that kind of divergence?
One way in the corporate case is that the goals of the corporation may be distinct from the individual's goals, or and conflict with the individual's moral commitments. Oftentimes people will say to me, well, there's no possibility of corporate virtue because their goal is to make money, and that is adamantly opposed to any morality, right? You're not going to get a good corporation then. And I mean, I guess what accounts for it is we're often, as individuals, not aligned with the organizations for which we work. I'm not so sure, though. I mean, we have conflicting moral obligations within ourselves as persons as well. So
Maybe I'm just curious how you would respond to that critique. Like, what would you say to somebody who says you can never have a good corporation?
I just think they're confused about what the corporate form is. I mean, first of all, yes, the stakeholder view of the corporation is very much, debated, first of all. But it's also true that you could want to make money, but also do things like make a good product or help people. So you could have multiple goals of an organization. Sometimes you would sort of have to make choices between those goals in order to achieve, prioritize them.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have one more question.
Do we have time?
I think we do have just a few more.
Thank you. Very interesting. It's a little hard for me to think about the organization as an agent, so I don't know if I'm going to get this quite right, but I think you're right that there's not much in the organizational literature on this topic. I did think of a couple of possible things, though. Most of it's conceptual rather than empirical. There are a couple of, and I can email you.
Yeah, that would be great.
There are a couple of papers about the normalization of wrongdoing in organizations. None of them are about honesty.
Yeah, right.
So the normalization of wrongdoing, there are a couple of papers that talk about use of emotion in order to persuade people to do one thing or another thing. One paper is kind of agnostic whether it's good or bad. Another paper, again, is about unethical corporations or organizations. And then one empirical example that might be interesting for you, my colleague at Boston University, Michelle Anteby, did an ethnography of HBS, and he talked specifically about morality in terms of the curriculum and how they're training their MBA students for going out into the world. And if I remember this right, his point had a lot to do with silence and how they weren't stepping in to do that. And then, what's the conclusion from that? What are they doing then? If they're not saying something, is that actually saying something? Is that saying morality is not important? So that would be an interesting empirical
that's great.
piece.
Yeah, if you could send me those references, I think that would be super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
This question earlier talking about emotions and organizations as agents, and then I started thinking about AI as an agent, which lacks emotion, or I would say, but it has, it's not collective, but it has developers and companies behind it, and so then I was trying to think through parallels or differences. I'm curious your thoughts of, so your analysis of us as an organization versus with the same logic or similar things, what holds if we start to think of for AI?
Yeah, good. I love the question about, I teach a course on kinds of minds, which really is focused on kinds of agency, and we talk about animal agency and the group case and then the artificial case. And I think they're just really nice heuristics for thinking about human agency, like what's different, what's the same. And for me, I think the artificial case, the AI or robots and everything, whether they count as agents rests on whether they're responsive to reasons. So I think it's clear that, and this is where I think Dennett, who famously said the lectern could be interpreted from the intentional stance, it would count as a minimal agent. He also said a thermostat would. I just think he's that's just wrong. I don't have a practice of explaining and predicting the actions of thermostat. I mean, he admits, you would take another stance. That would be the more plausible. But we have a rich practice of making sense of organizations. but also praise and blaming, and they're responsive to that practice. I don't think I mean, maybe AI agents could be responsive in that way, and where we would sort of develop a practice of praising and blaming AI agents. I think we're sort of getting there, right? We're already having, but whether they're going to be responsive to that and sort of be able to give and take reasons for their behavior, that's sort of an empirical question. Yes. So, and for me, that's the difference between us and animals. It's the difference between us and, whatever, the computer, and yeah.
All right, well, so everybody has a chance to take a break. Let's thank